The Ladies' Guild of Flaxborough, not ordinarily associated with excitement, contrived at last to provide it one unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. The cause was a funeral pie, or rather a dozen of them, arranged neatly on the trestle tables of the Methodist church hall, their browned crusts glistening with the careful brush-strokes of egg wash, their interiors advertised as solemnly traditional. It was the Guild's conviction that no respectable northern gathering could occur without such comestibles, and indeed the pies usually disappeared with quiet speed. What unsettled matters on this occasion was not their appearance, nor their predictable density of meat and spice, but the fact that one of the pies had apparently never contained anything at all recognizable. When sliced into by Mrs. Troke, who possessed both a vigorous wrist and a formidable palate, it revealed a filling of blackened pulp and greasy paper. The paper, though cooked to a state only barely short of cinders, bore the fragments of handwriting. The sight of it was sufficiently disturbing to cause Mrs. Troke to clap her napkin over her mouth, and Mrs. Glossop, seated beside her, to announce with inappropriate relish that it was just like something off that Poirot program. A ripple of talk spread down the rows of chairs. Miss Teat, the librarian, declared that sabotage was at play. Mrs. Pumphrey thought a scandal more likely, and the Reverend Bodkin, who had been looking hopefully towards the custard tarts, muttered something about wickedness in high places, before retreating discreetly into prayer. By tea-time, the news had circulated well beyond the hall. Shoppers in the High Street were heard wondering aloud whether the Guild had finally overreached itself, and the landlord of the Caxton Arms announced to his regulars that the town was at last getting some proper mystery. That it was a minor one, and concerned no actual corpse, did not appear to disappoint anybody. The police station received its first telephone call within the hour. Sergeant Malley, manning the desk with the air of a man resentful of afternoons, was urged to send someone at once before the pies were all consumed and the evidence lost. Malley promised that an officer would be along directly, and, when he put down the receiver, found Inspector Purbright already standing by his shoulder. The inspector had the quiet look of one who had been waiting for the town to provide just such a morsel of curiosity. He inquired whether the Guild ladies were in any great distress. "Not the Guild, sir," Malley replied. "They're enjoying it. It's the pies they're distressed about." Perbrite allowed himself a faint smile. "Then I'd better have a word before imagination expands the case beyond our resources." When he entered the Methodist Hall a few minutes later, he was received like a visiting magistrate. The assembled ladies, flustered but also faintly triumphant, clustered about the trestle table to display the offending pastry. A saucer had been placed beneath the slice, as though its contents required a form of ceremonial reverence. The remaining pies gleamed along the row, solid and uncontroversial, as though attempting to dissociate themselves from their aberrant companion. Perbrite bent over the dish and considered the soggy paper. He did not touch it, nor did he comment immediately. His silence encouraged the crowd to offer explanations. "It's a message," said Mrs. Glossop firmly. "Just like they did in the war little notes smuggled in bread rolls." "Nonsense," objected to Miss Teat. "Someone has been playing a malicious prank." Mrs. Troke sniffed. "Malicious, yes, but not a prank. That there's someone's private letter." At which point Mrs. Pumphrey lowered her voice to a stage whisper. Perhaps it was meant for a particular person, hidden in the pie, waiting for the right mouth to discover it. The Reverend Bodkin, overhearing this, reddened and demanded that the ladies recall themselves to Christian charity. He was ignored. Inspector Perbrite straightened, looked about the group with his usual mildness, and asked, "Might I take this away for a little examination?" There was a chorus of agreement, relief, and renewed speculation. He folded the saucer in a handkerchief, thanked them gravely, and promised to return the plate at the earliest opportunity. On his way out, he was stopped by Mrs. Troke, who clutched his sleeve with unexpected strength. "You'll find out who's behind it, won't you, Inspector? There's spite in this town, I've said it for years. Purbright nodded. Spite is one of our more reliable commodities. Outside, the air of Flaxborough's High Street was fresh with the scent of damp cobbles and overripe apples from a greengrocer's barrow. The inspector paused, not in urgency but in thought, and walked slowly back to the station. Behind him, gossip was already moving faster than his tread, attaching names, motives, and guilty histories to the funeral pie. The case had not yet begun, but it had already taken on a life of its own. Inspector Perbrite did not hurry to his office with the mutilated pie. That would have lent the business too much drama, and he preferred to let drama be the preserve of the townsfolk. Instead, he strolled along Flaxborough's High Street at his usual unhurried pace, acknowledging a nod here and a lifted hand there, looking for all the world like a man carrying nothing more consequential than a parcel of buns. The saucer, neatly swaddled in his handkerchief, was handled with the discretion of a nurse transporting a patient's sputum specimen. Inside the police station, Sergeant Malley glanced up from a crossword and noted with disappointment that the inspector was not visibly encumbered by scandal. "That is then, sir. The pie, what's got everyone talking?" Purbright set the bundle on his desk. "This is the item. And I would be grateful, Malley, if we could postpone its contribution to town mythology until I've looked at it more closely." Malley gave a nod that was half a shrug. "Too late for that, sir. The Caxton Arms is saying it was witchcraft already." Unfolding the handkerchief, Perbrite revealed the soiled slice. The blackened mass clung together stubbornly, but enough letters remained on the paper to hint at sentences. He picked up a magnifying glass and peered at the charred edge. "It appears," he murmured, "that somebody attempted to write a letter, and then, for reasons perhaps not wholly benevolent, baked it." Malley leaned forward, squinting. "Can you make anything out?" The inspector traced a line of half-obliterated words with his finger. Something about account and possibly settled. Then another part, truth must, and the rest is gone. "Sounds like a quarrel," Malley suggested helpfully. "Or an apology," Purbright replied, with the mild tone of one unwilling to arrive too quickly at anything so useful as a conclusion. He folded the paper carefully, slid it into an envelope, and then wrote a neat label across the front. By late afternoon, the Methodist Hall had emptied, leaving only a faint residue of tea cakes and gossip. Purbright decided it was time to gather some recollections while tongues were still warmed by speculation. His first visit was to Mrs. Glossop, who, despite her formidable appetite for mystery, had a reputation for remembering details that others mislaid. She lived in a neat, semi-detached, with an iron boot scraper shaped like a cat. When she opened the door, she looked almost disappointed that the inspector had come to ask about the pie, rather than to announce the capture of a master criminal. "Of course, I'll tell you everything," she said, ushering him into a parlor saturated with the smell of lavender polish. "But I dare say you've already guessed it must be a warning. I said so the moment I saw the thing." Perbrite took a chair opposite her glass-fronted cabinet of commemorative mugs. "You were sitting beside Mrs. Troke when the pie was cut?" "Yes, and she nearly dropped the knife on her lap. I told her it looked like sabotage, but she only sniffed. She doesn't like me, you see. I think I talk too much." The inspector's polite silence encouraged her further. "And another thing," she added, lowering her voice, though no one else was present. "Mrs. Troke herself brought those pies. Said she'd bake them with her niece. Now, if there's something unpleasant inside one of them, you'd think she'd know, wouldn't you?" "That depends," Perbrite said gently, "on who supplied the filling." Mrs. Glossop looked startled, then delighted at the idea of shared conspiracy. "Ah, now, that's just the sort of point others overlook. You always did have a nose for mischief, Inspector." When he left her house, Purbright strolled next door to Miss Teet, whose curtains twitched before he had even touched the gate. She admitted him with the air of a custodian reluctantly opening an archive. It was no accident, she declared before he asked a single question. That pie was meant to frighten someone, possibly me. Why you, Miss Teat? She straightened. Because I know things. People borrow books and forget that librarians can see exactly what they're reading. Poison, forgery, legal trials. You'd be amazed what passes across my desk. Someone may think I put two and two together. And did you? Her eyes darted. Not yet. But I could. The inspector offered no encouragement, only a courteous nod. He was accustomed to the self-importance of custodians of knowledge, even when the knowledge amounted to no more than a record of overdue romances. As dusk settled, Purbright walked slowly back to the station, considering the competing interpretations. To each witness, the pie had been not merely food, but a mirror of their own anxieties to Mrs. Glossop, a scandal among neighbours to Miss Teat, a threat to an all-seeing librarian and to Mrs. Troke, an insult to her culinary dignity. He reached his office just as the lamplighter on the high street was making his rounds and found Sergeant Malley hunched over the telephone. "Report from the Reverend Bodkin, sir," Malley said, covering the mouthpiece. "Says he's remembered a gentleman who left the hall early, before the pie was cut. Tall chap, unfamiliar face." "Description?" Perbrite asked. "Only that he was wearing a grey hat and had a limp." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "A limp is useful. Grey hats, less so." He returned to his desk and unfolded the envelope once more. This time he studied the charred words as though they might confess through sheer scrutiny. The town's appetite for melodrama was already transforming the incident into a Gothic tale, but to Purbright it remained a question of motive. Who had chosen the Methodist Hall, and why conceal a fragment of letter in a dish meant to commemorate respectability? The following morning he called upon Mrs. Troke herself. She greeted him with a flurry of apron and indignation, for by then the story had travelled the length of the market. "It's spite, Inspector. Pure spite. My niece and I laboured all evening, and we'd never put such a thing in a pie. Somebody's tampered with it. Your niece assisted with the baking?" "She did. Clever girl, though a bit dreamy. Always scribbling in her notebooks, but she'd never do a thing like this." "Where is she now?" "At work in the drapery. You can ask her yourself if you must." Purbright made a note. He let the silence rest until Mrs. Troke added, "And don't believe a word from that Glossop woman. She'd say I poisoned the vicar if it gave her the chance." When he stepped outside, a group of townspeople loitered across the street, their expressions a blend of curiosity and relish. Word had clearly spread that the inspector himself was making house calls. By nightfall, every pub and parlour would be rehearsing the same story with its own improvements. Perbrite walked on, patient and steady. Somewhere among the rumours and rivalries lay the small truth that would, in due time, reveal the larger one. For the moment, however, he permitted himself only this thought: it was remarkable how a funeral pie could so quickly resuscitate the spirits of a whole town. Perbrite, with his customary air of unhurried inevitability, presented himself at the drapery shop the following afternoon. It was a modest establishment on the high street, its front window displaying a careful geometry of bolts of cloth, haberdashery jars, and a mannequin that seemed perpetually caught between mourning and matrimony. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of camphor and starch. Behind a counter stacked with folded remnants stood a girl of perhaps 19, her dark hair pinned loosely, her fingers ink-stained despite the work of cloth and ribbon. "You must be Miss Hargreaves," Purbright said, inclining his head in a manner that suggested courtesy rather than interrogation. The girl flushed, glanced at the shop's only other occupant, a stout woman examining curtain samples, and replied, "Yes, Inspector. Aunt said you might call. I gathered you assisted with the baking yesterday. May I trouble you for a word or two?" She glanced nervously at her employer in the back office, who was pretending to tot up figures but in reality listening intently. With a timid nod, she led Purbright to a quieter corner near the lace counter. I did help, yes, but only with the pastry. Aunt insists on making the filling herself. I didn't even see what she put in. Her voice was hushed, conspiratorial, though clearly tinged with the worry of being overheard. Perbrite observed her carefully. I understand you like to write. The flush deepened. Oh, it's nothing. Just little stories. I'd never put them in a pie, if that's what you're thinking. I hadn't quite reached that conclusion, he replied mildly. But someone did place a piece of paper inside one. Whether by clumsiness or design remains to be seen. You've not lost any notes recently? She shook her head emphatically. I'm careful. I keep everything in a box under my bed. The inspector smiled gently, as though he had been told the location of buried treasure. Then we may put that aside. Thank you, Miss Hargreaves. You've been most helpful. When he left the shop, the autumn sun was lowering behind the rooftops, lengthening the shadows of gossip. He had not missed the stiffness in the girl's answers, nor the quick defensive edge to her denial. But Perbrite was not in the habit of drawing his net too soon. Instead, he allowed the town itself to tug at the threads, confident that eventually some loose end would dangle temptingly within reach. By evening, the Reverend Bodkin sought him out at the station, carrying the solemn air of a man convinced of spiritual warfare. Inspector, I must insist upon your attention. There are dark whispers that the guild supper has been cursed. Several of my parishioners are refusing to attend the autumn bazaar, saying the devil himself has been invited into the pastry. Do they propose to bar him at the door? Perbrite asked. Bodkin blinked, missing the irony. The situation is grave. And I remind you, there was a stranger present that afternoon. Tall fellow with a limp. I'm convinced he left the message in the pie. Who else could it have been? The inspector thanked him for his vigilance and promised that the matter was under consideration. As soon as the clergyman had gone, Malley muttered, If we start arresting folk for limping, sir, we'll have half the town limping by morning just for notoriety. Quite so, Purbright murmured, which makes it all the more useful to wait. Later that week, the envelope containing the charred paper received its first serious scrutiny. Perbrite enlisted the help of young Constable Clay, who possessed a gift for patient fiddling. With a pair of tweezers, Clay teased apart the scorched fragments under a lamp. Slowly, faint words emerged in patches. Truth account cannot be hidden. Looks like someone settling scores, Clay observed. Or someone pretending to, Purbright said, pocketing the fragments once more. The next step took him to the Caxton Arms, not because he expected enlightenment, but because inns often distilled the essence of town opinion better than any formal interview. He found the snug already alive with theories. Mrs. Glossop had been in the night before and told everyone the paper was part of a will. Old Mr. Croot insisted it was a recipe stolen from his late wife, and a farmer with red hands claimed it was an insurance swindle being confessed in pastry form. Purbright listened politely, sipping half a pint, contributing nothing. But when he left, he carried with him the knowledge that speculation itself might be useful. Whoever had engineered the pie would be watching eagerly to see which story gained traction. In their reaction, they might betray themselves. The following day brought a development both trivial and oddly telling. Miss Teat appeared at the station clutching a slip of paper she claimed to have discovered slipped between the pages of a returned library book. The note read in a spidery hand, "The truth must be swallowed." Malley raised his eyebrows. "That's it, sir. It's a plot. Someone's leaving crumbs everywhere." Perbrite took the paper, studied it without expression, and placed it beside the pie fragment. The writing was not identical, yet it carried the same odd phrasing. One message in a pie, another in a book, he said softly. Our culprit has a fondness for context. By evening, the matter had entered another stage. Mrs. Troke, stiff with outrage, arrived at the station demanding protection. People are saying I baked that note on purpose. I'll not have my good name ruined. You must tell them I didn't." "Alas, Mrs. Troke," Purbright said with quiet sympathy, "if I began correcting all the town's assumptions, I'd never do anything else. The best defense of your reputation is to remain calm. Truth has a way of enduring, even in Flaxborough." She was not comforted, but her indignation furnished the inspector with something more valuable than complaint, a sharper picture of the personal stakes. If the incident had been designed merely as mischief, it was succeeding magnificently. If, however, it served some more pointed aim, then the target had yet to be properly identified. That night, as Purbright sat in his office listening to the hum of the radiator and the faint scrape of Malley's pen across forms, he reflected on the curious blend of theatre and malice in the case. There was nothing yet to suggest violence, yet an undercurrent of menace clung stubbornly to the words, "truth must." They had been chosen deliberately, almost provocatively, as if the writer desired not to conceal, but to disturb. The town, meanwhile, had been shaken into fresh vitality. The drapers, the grocers, even the chemist's assistant had their versions of what the paper signified. Children chanted about the pie with the lie in the street, and elderly men claimed it reminded them of spy tricks in the last war. Perbrite allowed himself a thin smile. Gossip might yet prove more illuminating than analysis, but somewhere beneath the talk lay a genuine, intentional accusation, perhaps, or a warning meant for one person alone. And until that person betrayed themselves by reaction or silence, the inspector would continue his quiet, patient listening. The week settled into a rhythm of small revelations, each one seemingly insignificant, but together weaving a fabric dense enough to conceal something larger. Flaxborough's appetite for the mystery had not waned. Indeed, by Wednesday, funeral pies had become a shorthand in conversation. In the butcher's, customers joked about checking their sausages for sermons. At the post office, a widow asked nervously if a letter might arrive baked into her next parcel. The town, which usually required the steady drip of scandal to enliven it, now basked in a torrent. For Perbrite, however, the entertainment of others was little more than background noise. What interested him was the peculiar consistency of the wording on both the pie fragment and the library note. It was not just the message itself, but the sense of performance, of an author deliberately writing for an audience. That audience might have been the entire town, or it might have been one particular resident who alone recognized the allusion. On Thursday morning, Constable Clay intercepted him with news that the drapery girl, Miss Hargreaves, had been seen slipping an envelope into the library's return slot after hours. The report came from Miss Teat, who delivered it to the station in the confident manner of a woman accustomed to being right. Clay, however, seemed embarrassed to relay it. "She said she watched from her window, sir. But, well, Miss Teat does keep an eye on everyone." Purbright nodded. "The town's unpaid watchmen are often our most diligent. Still, we mustn't treat every observation as gospel." Nonetheless, he walked to the library later that day, arriving just as Miss Hargreaves was stepping out with a stack of books tied together with ribbon. Her face colored when she saw him, and she clutched the volumes as though they might provide a shield. "You've been busy with your reading," Perbrite remarked pleasantly. "May I ask what interests you just now?" She hesitated. "Poetry, mostly. Some novels, and a book on ciphers." The last word emerged reluctantly, and her eyes flickered with an apology she had not voiced. "Ciphers," Perbrite repeated softly. "A demanding subject for leisure. It was just curiosity. I saw it on the shelf. I like puzzles." He inclined his head, letting the silence draw out. The girl shifted under it, then quickly added, "I didn't put anything in the book, if that's what you've heard. People like to make things up." "People do," he agreed. "But sometimes what they make up has a kernel of truth. It can be hard to separate them." He did not press her further, but bid her good day with a mildness that left her both relieved and unsettled. Back at the station, Mally was ready with another contribution from Flaxborough's collective imagination. "Got word from the grocer's delivery lad, sir. Says he heard a man in a grey hat asking after the Troke woman's baking. Sounded foreign, apparently." "Foreign?" Purbright asked, placing the word delicately on his tongue. "That's what the lad said, though in his book, anyone from Lincoln counts." Perbrite allowed himself the faintest sigh. The limping stranger had already become the phantom on whom all uncertainties might be hung. A grey hat and a limp so conveniently anonymous that half the town might qualify by merely altering their gait. That evening he sat down to consider the sequence so far. A pie, sabotaged with a charred note. A librarian discovering another cryptic message in a book. A niece with a taste for codes. And a stranger glimpsed fleetingly, whose very vagueness had inflated him into a figure of dread. None of it amounted to more than whispers stitched together by rumor. Yet the pattern was undeniably deliberate. Someone wanted attention fixed on the idea of hidden truths, of accounts unsettled. The following morning brought a more tangible development. The Reverend Bodkin, white with indignation, appeared once again at the station. This time he carried with him a brown envelope addressed in shaky handwriting to the Reverend. Inside was a single sheet on which the same words appeared. The truth must be swallowed. "This is a direct attack upon my ministry," he declared, banging the desk. "Whoever is behind this is mocking the very pulpit. I demand you take action." Purbright examined the letter, his eyes narrowing slightly. The words were almost identical to those on the paper in the pie and the slip from the library. Yet the ink was darker, fresher. "When did this arrive?" he asked. "This morning's post, delivered with my parish correspondence." My housekeeper nearly fainted. The inspector folded the sheet calmly. "Thank you, Reverend. I shall add this to our little collection." When the clergyman had left, Mally muttered, "That's 3 times we've had the same message, sir. Someone's enjoying themselves." "Yes," Perbrite replied. "But enjoyment seldom lasts long without purpose." That afternoon he took a quiet walk through the churchyard, where damp leaves clung to the stones and the yews hunched in their perpetual gloom. The graves bore names that stretched back centuries, families interlaced, reputations buried along with bodies. He paused by a recently tended plot and wondered, not for the first time, whether the business of the pies had less to do with present-day spite and more with the shadow of an older grievance. On his return, he found Clay waiting with a fresh discovery. "Sir, I checked the envelopes again. The one from the pie and the one from the Reverend, they've both been torn from the same sort of exercise book. School type, cheap paper, faint blue ruling." Purbright's expression betrayed nothing. "And the library slip? That was on similar stock, though smaller. Could be from the same hand." The inspector leaned back in his chair, considering. Miss Hargreaves, with her ink-stained fingers and notebooks under the bed, naturally came to mind. But he was not yet ready to make her the centerpiece of the puzzle. Too much eagerness risked missing the subtler possibility that someone else was planting suspicions around her. Evening closed in with the lamps flickering on along the high street. From the Caxton Arms drifted laughter as the locals rehearsed their favorite rumors. And as Purbright looked out from his office window, he felt the case shifting, not dramatically but with the quiet inevitability of a tide turning. A letter in a pie had been eccentric enough now that the same phrase was circulating like a contagion, passed from plate to book to pulpit. Whoever authored it was not content with a prank. They were building towards something, drawing the town into their theater of truth and concealment. For now, Perbrite did nothing more than close the office blinds and reach for his pen, making a neat note in his ledger, 3 messages received. Same phrase. Paper is common. Author intent upon disturbance. Further incidents are likely. He placed the pen down carefully, as though by its position he might persuade events to arrange themselves just as neatly. The morning that followed was heavy with mist, the kind that clung to the shop fronts and blurred the lines of the church steeple, giving the town an air of hushed complicity. Purbright, stepping into the police station with his umbrella, dripping faintly, was met by Sergeant Mallet's expression of grim satisfaction. Mallet, when in possession of news that threatened to thicken an already curious case, bore the look of a man who had proved at last that the world was every bit as inconvenient as he had always suspected. "They've found another note, sir. The same message against truth must be swallowed." This time it was in the bakery van, tucked in among the bread trays. Perbrite removed his hat, shook the moisture from it gently, and replied, "Our writer grows industrious. Perhaps they are anxious we might lose interest." Mallet grunted. The bakery lad fainted when he spotted it. "Says he's not touching another pie crust until the culprit's caught." Bad for business, that. The inspector took the slip, examined it under the lamp. The hand remained the same, uneven but deliberate, the letters leaning with faintly theatrical emphasis. "Each appearance in a new setting," he murmured, like a performance staged in episodes. "Our author may be more dramatist than mischief-maker." Later that morning, Perbrite returned to the drapery under the pretext of inquiring after linen shortages. Miss Hargreaves served him with eyes lowered, her usual quickness subdued. When he asked, in his unthreatening manner, whether she had heard of the bakery note, she gave a start and dropped a box of buttons. "I've heard, yes. But it wasn't me. Everyone thinks it's me." She looked up suddenly, her voice trembling with the strain of being young and suspected. "I write, but not like that. I'd never use words to frighten people." Perbrite regarded her steadily. "You are certain you've not used your scraps of paper borrowed, perhaps, without your knowledge?" She hesitated, then admitted, "Sometimes Aunt takes my old jotters for kindling. She says I scribble nonsense and waste paper. I don't always notice which ones go missing." "That is most interesting," Perbrite said, though his tone remained as mild as though she had described a change in the weather. He left her with a courteous bow, noting as he did the anxious figure of Mrs. Troke herself emerging from the back room, lips compressed into a line that could have sliced dough. In the afternoon, Purbright paid a call to the Methodist Guild's treasurer, Mr. Horniblow, who lived above a shop that sold fishing tackle to a town with no river worth mentioning. Horniblow was a man of pallid complexion and nervous fingers, perpetually rubbing the edges of coins in his pocket. "Yes, Inspector, I heard about the notes," he said, his voice quick and agitated. "But it's not my fault. The guild accounts are in order, perfectly in order, whatever anyone may have said." Purbright had not, in fact, mentioned the accounts. He merely raised his eyebrows and allowed Horniblow to continue digging his hole. "There was some talk at the last meeting," the man went on, "about missing shillings, but it was all settled. Mislaid receipts, that's all. I assure you." "Of course," Purbright said, his voice so calm it might have been mistaken for indifference. "Mislaid receipts are a universal hazard." He left Horniblow perspiring gently in the fishing tackle shop and walked back into the mist, his mind balancing this new fragment against the others. By evening, the case had once again become the talk of the Caxton Arms. A local wit composed a rhyme that was already circulating. "The pies are lies, the loaves are proof, the truth must hide beneath a roof." Patrons roared with laughter, and the landlord repeated it so often that it acquired the air of prophecy. Yet amid the merriment, Purbright noticed one man who did not join Mr. Dodsley, the printer. He sat nursing his pint with a studied solemnity, his eyes fixed on the froth as though considering how many anonymous words could be hidden in its bubbles. The inspector drifted over, settled beside him with unobtrusive ease, and remarked, "Busy week for printing, Mr. Dodsley." "Somewhat," the man replied cautiously. "Orders for posters, church notices, That sort of thing. No notes requiring a particular flourish of phrasing. Dodsley blinked, then chuckled awkwardly. Inspector, if you're suggesting I've been slipping scraps into pies, I assure you my trade is entirely respectable. Purbright smiled faintly. I suggest nothing. But you'll understand why, in a town where handwriting has become a matter of such consequence, printers cannot escape notice. He left the man unsettled, which had been precisely his aim. That night, sitting at his desk, Purbright reviewed his growing list of potential authors. Miss Hargreaves, with her notebooks and fascination for ciphers, Mrs. Troke, with her stern sense of dignity and access to her niece's papers. Mr. Horniblow is defensive about his accounts. And now, perhaps, Dodsley, the printer with an uncanny stillness amid the noise. Each suspect carried motive in miniature, yet none sufficiently bold to declare itself. Perbrite closed the file, leaned back, and gazed at the ceiling. The refrain, "The truth must be swallowed," echoed with deliberate persistence. It was not an idle phrase, he felt, but one tailored to strike discomfort. The question remained, who in Flaxborough had something they wished buried beneath pastry and paper alike? Outside, the fog thickened into the narrow lanes and lamps glowed dimly like secrets refusing to be extinguished. Somewhere in the town, the unseen hand was already preparing its next act, and Perbrite, with infinite patience, waited for the curtain to rise. By Friday morning the mist had lifted, but only to reveal a sky the color of tarnished pewter, which hung low over the town as though determined to keep its secrets pressed close. Purbright, arriving at the station, found Sergeant Malley already rehearsing the latest contribution to the affair from a postman who claimed to have seen a small boy running from the churchyard with a notebook under his arm. More likely chasing after a football, Malley muttered, but the fellow swears blind it looked like the same sort of scribbler's book as the pie paper. Purbright took the information without comment, though in his mind he filed it neatly beside Miss Hargreaves' confession of her missing jotters. Children were useful scapegoats in Flaxborough. They could be credited with both innocence and devilment, according to convenience. The inspector spent the better part of the morning calling on the printer, Mr. Dodsley, in his little workshop at the end of a side lane. The shop smelled of ink and damp wood, and the steady rhythm of the press gave the place an oddly funereal heartbeat. Dodsley greeted him with a nervous politeness, his fingers still stained dark from typesetting. "I hope you won't think me impertinent, Inspector," he said, "but there's ridiculous talk that I've had something to do with these notes. I can assure you my business is entirely above board." "I never doubted it," Purbright replied with calm courtesy. "Still, I wonder whether any of your customers have asked for printing that struck you as unusual. Odd phrasing? Peculiar emphasis?" Dodsley frowned. "Nothing that springs to mind. The Reverend wanted hymn sheets, the council required posters about dog fouling, and the Women's Institute ordered notices for their charity jumble. All very ordinary. And yet, Perbrite said gently, these slips of paper bear the hand of someone with a taste for performance. If not you, then perhaps one of your acquaintances." The printer's eyes flickered just for an instant before he shook his head firmly. "I know nothing about it, Inspector. Nothing." Perbrite left him to his press, the thump of its mechanism sounding like a muffled heartbeat chasing him out the door. In the afternoon, the inspector turned his attention back to the Reverend Bodkin. The clergyman, still flushed with outrage from his mysterious letter, greeted him in the vicarage study. Bodkin was a man who had perfected the art of indignation, keeping it polished like brass. "This business is undermining the church," he complained. "My congregation whispers that the Almighty himself has sent a warning. I remind them it is the devil's work, but some insist it's a sign of judgment." Purbright looked round the study with polite interest. "It must be difficult to preach serenity when one's flock delights in panic." "Difficult," Bodkin huffed. "It's impossible. I intend to denounce the matter from the pulpit on Sunday. If the villain seeks to frighten me, He shall hear my defiance ringing through the rafters." Purbright inclined his head. That may indeed encourage a reply, and replies, "Reverend, can be most revealing." He left Bodkin pacing among his sermons, already rehearsing the thunder of righteous denunciation. Meanwhile, Malley had taken it upon himself to question the bakery boy more closely, and by evening he reported to Purbright with the air of a man proud of having cornered a fox. "The lad says the note in the van wasn't just lying about. It was tucked under the tray in such a way it couldn't have slipped there accidentally. Which means someone had access to the van after loading, but before deliveries. And the only person who fits that is Horniblow, because the van stops outside his shop on Thursdays." Perbrite listened, nodding slowly. "An interesting observation, Sergeant. But we must be careful. The trouble with evidence is that it tends to adopt the shape of the suspicion holding it. Meaning Horniblow's not guilty, sir." "Meaning," Purbright said with faint amusement, "that we should neither acquit nor condemn him until he has condemned himself." That night, as the town settled into its pubs and parlours, another ripple disturbed the surface. A second note was found, this time in the vestry cupboard where the choir robes were kept. A boy sent to fetch a surprise discovered it pinned to the inside of the door. The words were the same, but this time followed by an addition. "Soon all will see." When the message reached the station, Malley slapped it down as if it were a trump card. "There, sir, that's an escalation if ever I saw it." Purbright studied the new line with mild interest. "Indeed, our author has grown impatient. Theatre alone no longer satisfies their wish for revelation." Clay, hovering nearby, ventured, "Sir, do you think it's aimed at someone specific? Like the Reverend or Mrs. Troke?" "Perhaps," Purbright replied softly. "Or perhaps it is aimed at the whole town, which amounts to much the same thing." The inspector carried the note home with him, sliding it into the same envelope as its predecessors. That evening, while the lamps flickered in his study and the kettle muttered on the stove, he considered the handwriting under the steady glow of his desk lamp. It was not only uneven, but deliberately so, letters tilted, strokes heavy in one line and feathery in the next. A disguise, he thought, but one that betrayed the writer's self-consciousness. Someone was trying very hard not to look like themselves. Outside, the streets lay quiet, save for the occasional shout from the Caxton Arms. Inside, Purbright made a neat entry in his ledger, "Fourth message." First variation, the author seeks to quicken the pace. Watch for overconfidence. He closed the book, leaned back in his chair, and allowed himself a faint smile. The curtain was indeed rising higher. The actor behind these little scraps of theatre might soon find the play had run ahead of them. The vestry note quickly became the town's newest obsession. By the following morning, the grocer's wife was telling her customers it had been pinned to the vicar's cassock, while a retired schoolmistress solemnly assured anyone who would listen that it had been nailed to the church door in Luther's Manor. Perbrite, hearing these versions drift across the High Street as he walked to the station, reflected that Flaxborough's capacity for embroidery rivaled that of the Women's Institute. Inside the station, Sergeant Malley had already compiled a small ledger of sightings of suspicious behavior. One account claimed Horniblow had been spotted burning papers in his grate at odd hours. Another alleged that Mrs. Troke's niece had purchased unusual quantities of sealing wax. A third insisted that Dodsley the printer had been seen limping a detail which, when challenged, the witness admitted might have been nothing more than the man's shoe catching on a paving stone. Purbright listened with patient politeness, then closed the ledger. "If we are to chase every limpen letter, Sergeant, we shall need a force 3 times our size. Better, I think, to wait until the culprit grows too eager to resist betraying himself." That evening, the Reverend Bodkin delivered his promised sermon of denunciation. The church was full to its draughty rafters, not so much from piety as from curiosity. Flaxborough seldom resisted an opportunity to witness indignation dressed in clerical robes. Bodkin thundered against the cowardly author of mischief who dared hide behind anonymous scraps, declaring that the church would not be shaken by scribbles stuffed in pastry and pasted on cupboards. The congregation murmured approval, though some faces wore the look of people disappointed that no lightning bolt struck mid-sermon. Purbright, seated at the back in his habitual unobtrusive fashion, observed reactions rather than rhetoric. Miss Hargreaves, pale and fidgeting, kept her eyes fixed on her hymn book. Mrs. Troke sat stiffly upright, lips pressed into the unyielding line of a woman determined to be seen above reproach. Horniblow, in a pew near the aisle, dabbed his forehead repeatedly with a handkerchief, and Dodsley, the printer, leaned forward with an intentness that suggested more than dutiful listening. When the service ended, the inspector lingered outside beneath the lych gate, watching the congregation stream past. Most departed with chatter about the pie affair, but a handful slipped away silently. Among them was Horniblow, who moved quickly, avoiding greetings. Perbrite noted it without comment. The following day, another note appeared, this time not in a pie, nor a cupboard, nor a van, but pasted boldly onto the notice board outside the Caxton Arms. It bore the familiar words, but with yet another addition, the truth must be swallowed. Soon all will see. Debt demands its due. Malley presented it at the station as though it were a confession. That's money talk if ever I heard it. Debt, accounts, dues. Horniblow's up to his neck, sir. Perhaps, Perbrite said evenly. Though sometimes a person intent on pointing suspicion in a certain direction sprinkles a few breadcrumbs where he hopes we will follow. And our town, Sergeant, is particularly fond of breadcrumbs. Nevertheless, the inspector paid Horniblow another call. He found the treasurer pacing behind his counter of fishing tackle, hands twitching like minnows. At the mention of the new note, Horniblow blurted, "It isn't me. I've no debts, I tell you. My books are straight." "Then you are most fortunate," Purbright replied mildly. "For not everyone in Flaxborough can say the same." Leaving Horniblow paler than before, he walked the high street slowly, pausing here and there to exchange polite words with townsfolk. Each conversation confirmed what he already sensed. The phrase "debt demands its due" had struck a sharper chord than any previous message. In a town where unpaid bills and quiet borrowings were the mortar between bricks of respectability, the threat of exposure carried a peculiar sting. That evening, Constable Clay brought word of an altercation outside the Caxton Arms. Dodsley, the printer, had quarreled with a customer over an unpaid account, voices raised high enough to draw a crowd. Though it ended without blows, the incident added fuel to the notion that money lay at the heart of the mysterious campaign. Purbright, reflecting on this in his office, drew a neat line in his ledger, author escalating. Message shifts from truth to debt. Motive personal, not general. Watch for targeted pressure. He set down his pen, listening to the hum of the gas fire, and considered that the drama was no longer content with whispers in pastry. The writer sought confrontation, coaxing the town's guilty consciences into betraying themselves. Late that night, as he walked home through quiet streets, he noticed a figure lingering near the drapery shop. Miss Hargreaves, her face caught briefly in the lamplight, slipped something into the letterbox before hurrying away. Perbrite did not call out. He merely paused, noted the gesture, and continued on. It was not the act itself that interested him most, but the manner, furtive, hesitant, as though compelled by some private burden. Back in his study, he placed the day's note beside the others, aligning them carefully. The handwriting, though still disguised, showed signs of growing hurried, almost impatient. A performance sustained too long begins to fray at the edges. He wondered who in Flaxborough would be unable to resist one flourish too many, and what truth, once swallowed, might finally choke its author. The following morning brought with it a nervous energy that seemed to have seeped into every corner of Flaxborough. Shopkeepers stood in their doorways longer than usual, exchanging scraps of speculation. Housewives, on errands, carried their baskets as though half expecting to discover folded notes nestled among the cabbages. The latest message, invoking debts and dues, had struck uncomfortably close to home. For though many residents prided themselves on respectability, most lived with small secrets of credit and arrears tucked away like moths in the lining of coats. Inspector Purbright, strolling along the high street with his customary air of quiet detachment, was acutely aware of the shifting atmosphere. He noted how faces turned away just a fraction too quickly, how conversations broke off mid-sentence as he approached. Fear, he reflected, was spreading faster than humor now, and fear made people careless. At the station, Sergeant Malley was already bristling with the latest reports. "Another note, sir, this time pushed under the door of the pawnbroker's. Same words again, but now there's a line about the guilty choking on what they've swallowed. The pawnbroker's near in hysterics. Says someone's trying to ruin him." Perbrite read the slip without expression, folded it neatly, and slipped it into the growing file. Our author grows bolder. They want the town to believe every trade and transaction may be called into question. In a place where reputation is the strongest currency, that is a dangerous game. He decided the time had come to see Miss Hargreaves again, though not at the drapery. He encountered her instead in the library, bent over a book in a corner. When she saw him, she closed it quickly, as though caught in mischief. "You are fond of studying," Perbrite remarked, seating himself nearby. "Was it poetry again?" She hesitated, then admitted, "It was a history of trials. People who were accused, sometimes wrongly, sometimes not. It seems everyone has secrets, Inspector, even the innocent." Her voice trembled, and Perbrite studied her pale hands resting on the book's cover. "Do you feel accused, Miss Hargreaves?" "I feel watched. It's as if someone wants to push me into being guilty, whether I am or not." He did not press her further, but his calm gaze lingered long enough to assure her that he had understood more than she wished him to. That evening, Flaxborough gathered again in its favoured theatre, the Caxton Arms. The newest note was passed from hand to hand, beer-stained fingers smudging the words while interpretations multiplied. One man declared it a veiled threat against the pawnbroker for charging too much interest. Another was certain it referred to the Reverend himself, swallowing more than his share of parish funds. A woman laughed bitterly that it was aimed at her husband, who swallowed his wages in the snug every Friday. In a corner, Horniblow sat sweating into his pint, while Mrs. Troke, stiff with righteousness, told anyone who would listen that she hoped the culprit would be caught and made to swallow their own words. Perbrite, seated with quiet unobtrusiveness, watched the room's currents with interest. Each speculation was less important than the manner in which it was spoken. Who deflected suspicion too eagerly? Who relished pointing a finger at others? The pie, he thought, had served as an opening act. The notes were the performance in full swing. And somewhere among the audience sat the actor, unable to resist feeding his own drama. The following day delivered the first real crack in the performance. A constable found a discarded notebook near the river path, its cover scorched, its pages torn out. Only a few scraps remained, but on one of them was the half-finished phrase, "Truth must." The discovery was promptly relayed to the station, and Malley all but thumped the desk in triumph. There it is the source of the whole thing. That Hargreaves girl must have thrown it away to cover her tracks. Purbright examined the notebook with care. The handwriting on the fragment was close to the notes, but not quite identical. The pressure of the pen differed, the slope of letters less theatrical. "A useful discovery," he murmured, "though perhaps not quite the revelation you imagine, Sergeant. Still, it will serve as bait for whoever wishes us to believe Miss Hargreaves the author." That afternoon, Purbright paid a quiet visit to the pawnbroker, Mr. Withers, a thin man whose spectacles magnified eyes already enlarged by nervousness. Withers protested his innocence with shaking hands, insisting he had no enemies and owed nothing to anyone. But Perbrite, observing the man's crammed ledgers on the counter, suspected otherwise. Debts were not only owed by him, but to him, and the phrase "debt demands its due" might sting as sharply for a creditor as for a debtor. Walking back through the town, Purbright allowed the threads to settle in his mind. A niece with notebooks, a treasurer with trembling hands, a printer with an oddly rehearsed solemnity, a pawnbroker drowning in ledgers, all bound together by a phrase that had turned from oddity into menace. The author, whoever they were, was forcing Flaxborough to taste its own unease. As night fell, another note appeared, boldly posted on the church gate for all to see. This one read, "The truth must be swallowed. Soon all will choke. Sunday will bring it forth." The words, written larger than before, caused a sensation before the lamplighter had finished his rounds. By bedtime, the whole town buzzed with speculation about what Sunday might reveal. Perbrite, sitting alone in his office, studied the new proclamation with his customary composure. At last, he thought, the play had announced its climax. Sunday was only 2 days away, and the author of the drama, emboldened by attention, had promised revelation. And when men promise revelation, they rarely resist the temptation to deliver it themselves. The inspector closed his file, extinguished the lamp, and permitted himself the faintest smile. The stage was nearly set, and Flaxborough, eager for its performance, had already bought its tickets in gossip and fear. Saturday dawned with an unnatural brightness, the mist having cleared to reveal a sky so sharp it made the high street's rooftops look almost theatrical against it. The weather seemed to mirror the town's mood, expectant, restless, even a little giddy. Sunday's promised revelation, hinted at in the latest note, had already been magnified by rumor into something grander, darker, and more final than any scrap of paper could convey. Inspector Purbright, walking the cobbles with his usual calm, knew that anticipation itself could be as dangerous as any revelation. Flaxborough had worked itself into a state of near festivity, yet beneath the laughter ran a current of unease. When truth is promised, everyone fears their own shadow might be cast longest. At the station, Sergeant Malley thrust a fresh sheet of paper towards him. "Another one, sir. Found on the market cross this morning. Same hand. This time it says, 'The debt shall be paid in the house of God.' That settles it's the church they're aiming at." Perbrite read the words carefully, folded the note, and slipped it into the growing file. "Or they wish us to think so," he murmured. Constable Clay, hovering nearby, looked uneasy. "Sir, if they mean to cause a scene tomorrow—" "Then we shall attend the scene," Purbright replied, his tone mild as ever. "But I suspect the scene is what the author most desires. The question is not where, but why." The day's errands carried him first to the drapery, where Miss Hargreaves served customers with eyes lowered, her movements mechanical. When Perbrite greeted her quietly, she glanced up with a look that combined weariness and plea. "I suppose everyone thinks it's me again," she said softly. "Everyone thinks what best entertains them," Perbrite replied. "Flaxborough is not particular about evidence." She bit her lip, then whispered, "I didn't write those words. But I think I know who might have." Her glance flickered toward the curtained doorway behind the counter, where Mrs. Troke's silhouette shifted about like a prowling warden. "I can't say more." "Not here." Perbrite inclined his head in acknowledgement, made a small purchase of thread he did not need, and departed without further word. By afternoon, the town square was alive with chatter. The pawnbroker, still rattled, complained loudly that he was being persecuted by anonymous cowards. Horniblow, looking more wan than ever, muttered that the whole thing was a slander campaign aimed at the guild. Dodsley, the printer, was overheard telling a customer that the inspector would soon have no choice but to arrest somebody preferably quickly, before the town starves in suspense. Purbright, passing by, caught the remark, but gave no sign of it. Instead, he allowed himself to drift into the Caxton Arms that evening, where rumour by now had fermented into certainty. Several patrons declared that the sermon on Sunday would be interrupted by a public unmasking. Others swore that a hidden document, long suppressed, would be nailed to the pulpit for all to see. Each version was delivered with such confidence that one might believe the speakers had themselves penned the notes. In a quiet corner, Perbrite observed Horniblow again, his nervous dabbing with a handkerchief more frantic than before. Across the room, Mrs. Troke sat with two companions, her voice sharp, her gestures emphatic, as though determined to scold away any suspicion. And behind the bar, the landlord recited the latest rhyme in a voice so loud that even those who had already heard it a dozen times laughed anew. Leaving the inn, Perbrite walked slowly home, the night air cool and clean. His mind settled on the progression of the messages. First, a simple phrase, truth must be swallowed. Then the addition of threat, soon all will see. And now the invocation of debt, of the church, of Sunday itself. The hand behind these notes was no longer content with whispers. It was driving steadily toward a public climax. Back in his study, he laid out the slips in order across his desk. The handwriting, though disguised, betrayed small consistencies, the peculiar flourish on the letters, the hesitant loop of the D. These were not the unconscious slips of a child or a prankster, but the studied mannerisms of someone accustomed to writing for effect. A man of print, perhaps, or someone who wished to appear one. He sat for a long while, listening to the clock tick until at last he closed the file with quiet satisfaction. Tomorrow, Sunday, would bring the drama the town had been promised. Whether the author intended a revelation, a humiliation, or simply a theatrical fright, Perbrite intended to be there, quietly watching from the wings, ready to applaud or to close the curtain. Sunday morning arrived with a brittle chill, the kind that turned every cough into an echo and lent each footstep across the churchyard gravel a faintly conspiratorial sound. The congregation of Flaxborough assembled earlier than usual, drawn not so much by piety as by the appetite for spectacle. Men in stiff collars and women in feathered hats exchanged whispered wagers on what the revelation might entail. Some looked towards the church door as though expecting a villain to be dragged through it. Others glanced up at the tower, half imagining that a note would flutter down like a divine bulletin. Inspector Perbrite slipped into his customary place near the back, his calm expression revealing neither expectation nor impatience. To his left, Miss Hargreaves sat pale and tense, her hands twisting a handkerchief into knots. In a pew near the front, Mrs. Troke held herself upright, her hat a rigid monument to dignity. Horniblow fidgeted so incessantly that the wood beneath him creaked, and Dodsley, the printer, leaned forward with an air of theatrical anticipation, as though daring the unknown author to begin the show. The Reverend Bodkin, already bristling with indignation from the week's insults, delivered his sermon in tones more thunderous than usual. He denounced cowardly scribblers, urged the congregation not to be swayed by whispers, and declared that God's house would not be turned into a stage for farce. The congregation listened half-heartedly, their attention drifting to the notice board, the pulpit, the aisles, anywhere the promised revelation might suddenly appear. Then, at the height of Bodkin's peroration, a faint rustle disturbed the silence. A folded paper dropped from the gallery above, fluttering down into the aisle. A murmur rose, then swelled as a boy scooped it up and handed it to the church warden. The warden, embarrassed but compelled by the crowd's insistence, passed it forward to the pulpit. Bodkin unfolded the note with shaking fingers, scanned its contents, and turned scarlet. "The same nonsense," he bellowed. "The truth must be swallowed. Soon all will choke. The debt is in God's ledger." He tore the paper in two. His gesture meant as defiance, but interpreted by the congregation as confirmation that the climax had indeed arrived. Voices rippled, feet shuffled, hats craned for better sight. Purbright, unmoving, observed the reactions. Horniblow buried his face in his hands. Mrs. Troke pursed her lips tighter than ever. Dodsley's mouth twitched as though suppressing a smile, and Miss Hargreaves, pale as parchment, looked ready to faint. After the service, the churchyard became an impromptu debating floor. Theories abounded that the note foretold the exposure of a scandal in the guild, that the Reverend himself was the debtor in question, that the pawnbroker had orchestrated the whole affair to distract from his usury. Bodkin stormed among them, insisting that the matter was trivial mischief. Few listened. Perbrite moved quietly among the groups, asking mild questions, accepting evasive answers. When at last he returned to the station, he carried with him not the note it was already in his file with the others, but the sharper sense that the author's purpose was nearing completion. The play had reached its climax, only the revelation remained. In the afternoon, Constable Clay reported that Horniblow had been seen burning more papers in his grate. A neighbor complained of the smell, saying it was like roasted ink. Malley, triumphant, declared that this proved the treasurer was covering his tracks. But Perbrite, examining the report, simply murmured, "The difficulty with bonfires, Sergeant, is that they burn more smoke than truth." That evening, the inspector paid a discreet call on Miss Hargreaves at the drapery. She received him in the parlor, her eyes red from tears. "It isn't me, Inspector," she whispered. "I swear it isn't, but Aunt keeps saying I've brought disgrace. She says I'll ruin her name." "Your aunt is greatly concerned with her name," Perbrite observed gently. "Yet names are most often ruined by their owners, not their nieces." Miss Hargreaves hesitated, then added, "Aunt sometimes takes my notebooks without asking. She says she uses them for shopping lists, but I think she gives them away. I found one missing last week, the one where I practiced different handwriting. I'd been copying passages, trying to disguise my style. I wanted to see if I could write like a character in one of my stories." Purbright regarded her kindly. "That is a most useful confession, though not a guilty one. It tells me that whoever has been writing these notes may have borrowed your experiments. If so, the author intended suspicion to fall naturally upon you." The girl's relief was so sudden that tears spilled freely. Purbright left her with a gentle word of reassurance, though he knew her troubles were not yet ended. Suspicion was a hardy weed in Flaxborough's soil. Back at his desk, the inspector laid out the sequence of notes again, tracing the escalation from a single charred slip in a pie to the theatrical drop in the church. The handwriting, the phrasing, the insistence upon debts was a campaign not only of mischief, but of message. Someone had chosen to frame the truth as something swallowed, concealed, and now threatened to choke those who had hidden it. The question was no longer what the words meant, but to whom they were addressed. Late into the night, Purbright sat with the ledger open before him, recording the key observations Miss Hargreaves' notebooks used. Horniblow defensive. Dodsley eager, too eager. Troke anxious for a name. Bodkin baited but not central. Author theatrical. Sunday climax delivered. The next step is the revelation of debt itself. He closed the book with a quiet finality, then rose and looked out across the darkened High Street. The town slept uneasily, waiting for a truth it feared to hear. And Purbright, with the patience that so often made his work appear effortless, was content to let the author of this performance make the final move that would undo them. Monday dawned quieter. The town spent after its fevered anticipation of Sunday's spectacle. The church note had given Flaxborough the drama it craved, but without the promised thunderbolt of revelation, people were left restless, like playgoers, uncertain whether the curtain had truly fallen. By mid-morning, however, the suspense was cut short when Mr. Horniblow, guild treasurer and perpetual perspirer, was discovered collapsed in his shop, a litter of scorched paper in the grate beside him. He was alive, but only just, his nerves frayed beyond endurance. A neighbor summoned the doctor, who pronounced it nothing more fatal than exhaustion brought on by anxiety. When Purbright arrived, Horniblow clutched at him like a drowning man. "I didn't do it, Inspector. I swear. I never wrote a word of it. They'll all say it was me, but it wasn't." Purbright soothed him with a hand upon his shoulder, his calmness lending a stability that Horniblow lacked. "No, Mr. Horniblow, you are guilty only of believing yourself central to the play. That is what the author wanted. But fear is not guilt, though it may make a man appear so." Leaving him in the doctor's care, Perbrite returned to the station where Sergeant Malley awaited, brimful of theories. "If not Horniblow, sir, then who? The girl, the printer, or that troke woman with her nose in everyone's business?" Purbright, instead of answering, asked Malley to fetch the complete set of notes from the file. He laid them upon the desk, arranging them with deliberate neatness. "Look, Sergeant, at the progression. First a single phrase, 'Truth must be swallowed.' Then embellishments, 'Soon all will see.' 'Debt demands its due.' 'The house of God.' Each note swelling, like a chorus rehearsed too often. But notice the one element that remains constant: theatricality. These are not the jottings of an anxious girl or a guilty treasurer. They are the work of someone who cannot resist staging a scene." Malley squinted. "The printer, then?" Purbright allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "Precisely." That afternoon he visited Mr. Dodsley's print shop. The place was as always perfumed with ink and paper, the press thudding its solemn beat. Dodsley greeted him with forced geniality, though his eyes betrayed irritation. "You'll not have come about posters again, Inspector. I've ordered enough without police business." "I came about the handwriting," Perbrite said mildly. "Or rather, the attempt at handwriting. You see, theatrical disguises have their tells. The curve of your is, the way you cross a, they betrayed themselves in every note." Dodsley's face froze, the ink stains on his fingers twitching against his palms. "You had the means," Perbrite continued. "For what is a printer but a man who spends his life rehearsing words? You had the motive too, for I understand your accounts with the guild were less profitable than you wished, and you resented Horniblow's dismissals. And above all, you had the temperamental taste for drama. You could not resist writing yourself into the center of the stage." The printer gave a short, bitter laugh. "And what harm did I do? A few scraps of paper, a flutter of gossip, nothing more." "On the contrary," Perbrite said gently. "You frightened the town, tarnished reputations, and nearly broke a man. That is harmful enough." Dodsley slumped against the press, the last trace of defiance draining from him. "They never listen, Inspector. Those committees, those guild men. I thought if I gave them a scare, they'd see their hypocrisy." "Perhaps they would," Perbrite replied. "But they saw only theatre, and theatre, once the curtain falls, leaves nothing but swept floors." By evening, word had spread quietly but firmly that the culprit had been found. No public announcement was made, but the absence of further notes was confirmation enough. The town, with a mixture of relief and disappointment, folded the matter into its store of anecdotes. The funeral pies were spoken of with relish, as though the entire business had been contrived solely for Flaxborough's amusement. Miss Hargreaves, released from suspicion, returned to her scribblings with renewed secrecy, though she walked the high street with her head a little higher. Mrs. Troke continued to guard her name with ferocity, but in private moments seemed oddly subdued. Horniblow, chastened, went about his duties with less bluster, as though grateful to have been spared greater disgrace, and the Reverend Bodkin thundered once more about sin, though his congregation listened with only half an ear, waiting for the next scandal to amuse them. Inspector Purbright, in his office, completed his final entry in the ledger, "Author Dodsley the Printer." Motive resentment, dramatized. Method anonymous notes, designed to alarm and entertain. Outcome town diverted, culprit chastened, reputations unsettled but intact. He closed the book, set his pen neatly beside it, and reached for a pile of paperwork that had accumulated during the week's drama. Outside, Flaxborough resumed its rhythmic shops opening, children calling in the streets, gossip already shifting to new subjects. The funeral pies were remembered with fond horror, and the phrase "truth must be swallowed" was repeated with knowing chuckles over teacups. Perbrite, returning to his quiet paperwork, reflected with the faintest of smiles that in Flaxborough, truth was always swallowed but rarely digested.